Alright, I did the best 20 films of 2015 so far for me, so now let's get into the 20 worst films of 2016 so far. As a little disclaimer, I have not seen every single movie so far this year. There are plenty of movies that I missed. Even though my movie count for this year is already over 90. Over 90 movies. Still missed a lot. And also, this is the middle of the year edition, so that means only movies from January to June are acceptable movies in the countdown. So if there's a really bad movie you thought deserved to be on this list, but it's after June, then it's not acceptable for this list. Also, there are plenty of bad movies that I just simply haven't seen yet. I've avoided some of the really, really awful ones. At least I think so. And for now. Eventually I'm going to have to see them. But anyway, let's start off with some dishonorable mentions. I probably should have done an honorable mentions for my best of list. Didn't think that through. But anyway, 4 dishonorable mentions that just couldn't make the worst 20 so far. Well, they are Independence Day Resurgence. Yeah, I changed my score for that one. Now You See Me Too, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows, and Alice Through the Looking Glass. Yeah, those films just kept out of my top 20 worst films of 2016 so far. Yeah, I feel those dishonorable mentions were a little too meh to put into a worst category, but there are a few meh movies that still are in this top 20 worst films of 2016. And my number 20 is Backtrack. To be honest, I don't remember much about Backtrack anymore. I'm having trouble recalling all the things that happened in it. It's just one of those forgettable movies. I remember saying, hey, it has good acting in it, and it had a pretty interesting premise, and one that could work as a nice mystery thriller, but they tried to add the horror into it, and unfortunately they did the most cliched, most jump scare, most generic scares that a horror film could have. It felt like they were just trying to throw in the horror because, oh, it's about ghosts. It can't just be a thriller mystery with ghosts. It has to have horror in it too. So they did all the generic scares you'd expect from such a movie. Other than that, I think it probably could have had some potential. Unfortunately, it becomes a more mad, forgettable movie. My number 19 is the third of a franchise, and I like the other 2 movies for what they are. They're not great, but I enjoyed them. And for this one, it is easily the worst of the 3. So much to the point where it became laughably bad. It is the Divergent series, Allegiant. That's my number 19. It's just one of those movies that's so laughably bad that it is entertaining in that sense. With all the crazy sci-fi, CGI, weird, really low-budget looking CGI, to some of the bad acting and really weird story choices. This movie is actually a blast to watch if you go into it thinking, oh, it's a comedy because it's so bad. Plus, Miles Teller was very entertaining in this movie, and even when he was in the background, he had my attention. He was really hamming it up. I think there's definitely plenty of things that could have worked in this movie if it was done right, but for the most part, it's just a laughably bad movie. My number 18 is another young adult novel adaptation, and as well, it has some laughably bad moments. My number 18 is The Fifth Wave. Again, yet another young adult novel adaptation movie that does have potential, and I could see how some people could like it. But instead you mix in a forced romance like all these other young adult novel adaptations seem to need, some really stereotypical, generic acting, and throw in some really laughably bad moments where I couldn't stop laughing at the screen, and you have a pretty entertaining, yet could be considered really bland, young adult novel adapted movie. Yeah, definitely moments where it's so bad it's so good, but Then again, it is bad, so yeah, pretty meh movie overall. I have to say the most interesting thing that happened that night is after we got out of the movies, got out of the movie theater, we're waiting for traffic, and this guy comes out of the theater as well and says, "Hey, you saw Fifth Wave, right?" And my dad and I were like, "Yeah, we did." Wow. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Wow. Yeah, it does make you wonder. I guess we're getting the entertainingly bad movies out of the way first, because my number 17 is probably the most fun I had with a bad movie so far this year, and that is Gods of Egypt. Wow. It was so outlandish and really great because of that. It was convoluted, it was crazy, it was just awe-inspiring how crazy a lot of it was. But don't get me wrong, there was plenty of potential. It had that similar fantasy structure, that whole plot line of a hero's journey. It had plenty of things that work in plenty of other fantasy movies that could have worked in this one as well. And it is talking about gods from Egyptian mythology, which doesn't get used quite often in films. And there were plenty of aspects that did stay true to it story-wise and character motivation-wise. But overall, the movie was bonkers and fun because of it. Still bad, but fun bad. Alright, my number 16 is a comedy, and it is The Boss. I laughed a few times in it. I also do feel that Melissa McCarthy was good in it, and I liked her character. She had potential. And Peter Dinklage was probably the funniest thing of the movie other than Melissa McCarthy. Well, I still feel Peter Dinklage was the funniest. He was the most outlandish and cartoonish. And he had that similar Pixels vibe where he was just having a fun time and he was just being this over-the-top character. But Melissa McCarthy is definitely a close second because she had some character development. She actually is a person I could have cared for, has potential in being in a better movie, and she did make me laugh a few times. Unfortunately, other than those two things, the movie was really, really bad. Plus, it doesn't feel like it's the movie we wanted to see from the trailers. I know this is the trailer's fault, but let's face it. You probably went into it thinking, oh, this is going to be a story about someone high up, falls, is on the low, and then rises back up with this brownie empire. Well, you kind of get that a little bit, but you get that impression that, okay, it's going to be more about the brownie empire. It's going to be more about bonding with these different Girl Scout type characters. We're going to get more of the business aspect of it and some of the comedy with that. But no, it's nothing like that at all. I mean, that's just like a small portion of the movie. The only Girl Scout characters that you get from this brownie empire that gets some attention is, well, kind of like the daughter character that is an important character of the film, and then the one that they show in the trailer, the bully type brute character. Other than that, you don't know any of the other people in the entire Girl Scout brownie empire people. It had potential and made me laugh quite a few times, but just not enough for me to consider it a good movie. Alright, my number 15 is a January movie, and you'll see quite a few January movies on this countdown. A lot of people said we had a pretty good January, but I beg to differ. And this one's a Western. This is a film you might not have even heard about. It is Diablo. And it was clear that this movie was banking off of the fact that they had Clint Eastwood's son as the main character. Scott Eastwood playing in a Western. They wanted to cash in on that. I mean, just look at the cover. Doesn't it look like a Clint Eastwood type film? The way they have Scott Eastwood looking? He looks like he could be a young Clint Eastwood. Anyway, there is definitely potential in the storyline of this movie. I found the storyline pretty interesting once it gets to the second half of the film, because it tries to be, well, I don't want to give away the twist, but there is a psychological element to it. Unfortunately, it's not explored all that well in the first half, to the point that it needed to be. The cinematography is pretty good, and the action towards the end of the film is really good as well. The second half really picks up, and it's around the time when Danny Glover comes into this film. Yeah, Danny Glover is in this film, and around that time, that's when the movie starts really picking up. Other than that, it's pretty slow and boring, except for a few occasional really laugh out loud bad moments. Like the time he meets the Indian kid and throws away the bow and arrow and says, "That wasn't very nice," or something like that. Oh my god. My number 14 is another January film, and it's a horror film that a lot of people seem to like and say, it's not that bad considered other January horror films, but I feel that it's the norm of January horror films. My number 14, The Forest. Look, there's a lot of things I like about it. There's things that could have worked as a really nice horror film. I like the whole psychological aspect, the aspect where this forest seems to come to life and feels like it's this impending darkness that's trying to manipulate people into committing suicide and making them think things that are real, that aren't real, that are real. There's this whole psychological element to the film that I think is really great. The acting is good as well, save for a few really bad delivered lines towards the end of the film. But unfortunately, the psychological elements are too obvious. There are so many times where it's like, okay, I understand this is a trick, and our character doesn't realize it, and it's almost to the point where it feels like our main character is just really dumb. Like, one of the nice things about psychological horror films is when something is shown on screen and we're wondering, questioning whether it's real or not, and we can't quite tell, okay, is this real, is this not? And sometimes we don't even figure it out till the end of the film. Sometimes we never figure it out, and it's up to the imagination of the audience. Questioning what's real and what's not is one of the great things about psychological horror, or any psychological thriller. Unfortunately, in The Forest, it's so blatantly obvious that a lot of this is trickery, and a lot of it is not all in her mind and not really there, to the point of it feeling a little tedious. Plus, there's plenty of really cliched horror in this film as well that doesn't feel very Japanese horror. Like, I feel that it should have some of those elements to that, because they are in Japan, and they are going into a forest in Japan, and it's a horror movie, so it should have some of those aspects to it, wouldn't you think? My number 13 is another horror film, and I don't know, it was just a pretty bad one. It had some interesting things about it, but I don't know, there's not much I can say about it. It's Bleed. Honestly, it's just one of those horror movies that I don't really like that much, and I can't really think of why I don't like it as much, or just what makes this so bad, but there's just something about it that I just dislike it overall. I guess another one of those aspects is there's like a Rob Zombie ghost in this movie. I mean, it's not Rob Zombie, but it looks a lot like something you'd expect for Rob Zombie. That whole thing about him, too, is a little weird, because he's supposed to be, spoiler alert, the good ghost that's protecting our main girl, yet he has no problem killing one of the characters that's supposed to be good, just randomly. My number 12, I think, is supposed to be a comedy. It's Get a Job. And if you look at the poster, it almost looks like a rom-com, especially with the two actors in it. I mean, they're two young actors, well, actor and actress. But it's definitely not a rom-com, and it's barely a comedy for me. I mean, there's some funny moments in it, and it clearly is trying to be funny while trying to be dramatic at the same time. It had a lot of really good stars in it, a lot of good actors and actresses, but this movie tries to do too much. Okay, the whole basic premise is people trying to get a job, whether they have been fired from a job and are getting a new job, or they just need a job in general. So overall, all the characters, all their aspects in life, their goals is to get a job or to get higher up in a job. And so it tries to mess around all these different things about those different jobs and tries to throw in all these side plots and side characters, but it's barely over an hour long. I think it's like a hour 20 minutes maybe, and they try to throw in too much to the point where everything feels basic, unfinished, and underdeveloped. It was pretty bland and boring, despite a lot of great stars being in the movie. Alright, apparently my number 11 is controversial because it does have a cult following. It's my most liked and my most hated movie review that I have. My number 11 is 400 Days. Alright, granted my review wasn't all that great because I didn't think a lot of people would be liking this movie. It felt obvious to me that this was a pretty bland, boring movie trying to be smart, but if you try to think of it in this ultra deep thinking way that the movie wants you to believe it's smart, it turns out that, yeah, everything falls apart if you overthink this movie or think in the way that the movie wants you to think. Similar to The Force, this is a psychological movie, a psychological horror / sci-fi movie, but similar to The Forest as well, the psychological aspects become so obvious that it really isn't a question on what's real and what's not. It just becomes too obvious, and when it is obvious, it also doesn't make sense as well. Like, there are plenty of contradictions in this movie to the point where it doesn't feel like there's any answer whatsoever. Like, you can think of all these different theories of what does it mean and what is really going on, but as you think about it, there are many things in the movie that's like, okay, well that makes this theory wrong, okay, so it's not that. Oh, but there's contradiction this, so this theory doesn't work, and oh, neither does this because there's something off about that. Almost to the point where it feels completely meaningless. Plus, the acting is bland, the characters don't really have that much depth to them, and at the end of the movie it turns into a sort of like this, a totally different movie altogether, where it's like these cannibals and 400 Days was a pretty bad movie, and I'm surprised it actually has a cult following, because I thought that if any underrated, very small sci-fi movie could get a cult following that I've seen, it should be Terminus. And I haven't seen what is that movie? It's some time-traveling movie. I haven't seen it yet. But from what I've seen from the trailers, that probably could have been an underrated, really good sci-fi movie as well. I still haven't seen it yet, though, so I can't judge it yet. But instead, it's 400 Days gets the cult following? Really? I do plan on making an in-depth review of 400 Days like I did with Cabin Fever, to show all the contradictions and show that, yeah, this movie isn't as smart as you think it is, and to prove that I do understand the movie, because my movie review was half-assed because I didn't think anyone would even bother seeing the movie.